Wyoming Territory, 1883, the wind cut across the high plains with a bite that carried more than cold, it carried whispers. Whispers about the widow who lost 2 husbands and still held her head high. Willa Barnes stepped out of the mercantile with a sack of flour in one hand and her daughter's small fingers wrapped in the other. Her black skirts trailed behind her, catching on the porch boards. Her boy chased after a chicken that had wandered too close to the road, his laughter loud and unbothered. "Careful, Clara," Willa said gently as she helped her daughter down the steps. "And Caleb, leave that bird be." The townsfolk stared the way they always did. "She cursed, that one," muttered a woman near the well. "She buried 2 men in 5 years. Either she is unlucky or she is plain rotten." Willa kept walking. She had heard it all before. Her first husband had been gored by a bull outside Cheyenne. The second well, Jed had taken a bullet 2 years back trying to stop a stage robbery. Neither death had been her fault, but folks in Sweet Haven preferred their stories tidy. She lifted Clara onto the wagon seat, then helped Caleb up beside her. They were only 8 and 6, but already they knew how to hold silence like armor. "Should we go by the river today, Mama?" Caleb asked, brushing hay from his coat. "We need to get home," she said, climbing up beside them. "Storm's coming tonight." The road out of town was rutted and dry and the sun hung low behind the clouds. She had just passed the edge of the cottonwoods when she saw the rider. He was slumped sideways in the saddle, blood darkening the side of his shirt. His horse stumbled, exhausted. Willa pulled the reins hard. "Stay here," she told her children, grabbing the rifle from beneath the seat. The man barely held himself upright. Dust clung to his face and his hat was gone. "Sir," she called, stepping close. "You are bleeding." He blinked like he was just now remembering the world around him. "Ma'am." Then he passed out. Willa caught his shirt as he fell, cursing under her breath. The weight of him nearly pulled her down, but she managed to lower him gently. Clara peered down from the wagon. "Is he dead?" "No," Willa said quickly, pressing her hand to his ribs. "But he will be if I do not get him home." She did not have time to think. She hoisted him into the back of the wagon, laid his head on a sack of oats, and told the children to sit tight. The man did not stir as they reached the homestead. She drove the wagon right up to the porch, then pulled him down with a grunt. Inside the cabin, she laid him on her bed where no man had slept since Jed died. "Clara," she said, her voice steady, "fetch the water." "Caleb, bring the needle box." The bullet had gone clean through, just below his ribs. She cleaned it, stitched it, and wrapped him in bandages. The fever hit by nightfall. For 2 days he burned with it. Willa wiped sweat from his brow, spooned broth past his lips, and wondered who he had been before the blood and dust. On the 3rd day he opened his eyes. "You are not dead," she said, sitting beside the bed. He blinked at her, confused. "I feel like I should be. You are lucky my wagon passed you when it did." "Where am I?" "Barnes homestead, 10 miles north of Sweet Haven." He tried to sit up and winced. "Name's Silas Dorne." She handed him water. "Willa Barnes." "Those are my children, Clara and Caleb." His gaze moved to the corner where the children sat quietly. "You saved me." "Not out of charity," she said. "You will be digging fence posts for weeks once you can stand." He gave a tired grin. "Fair enough." That night after the children had gone to bed, Silas sat at the edge of the porch wrapped in a blanket. Willa brought him coffee. "Where were you headed?" she asked. "Nowhere in particular," he said. "Been drifting cattle east from Montana, got jumped by 2 men near the river. Took my horse, my gun, and left me for dead. You are lucky they did not finish the job." He looked at her across the rim of the tin cup. "I reckon I was." The silence stretched between them. The wind moved through the grass. "You married?" he asked. She let out a breath. "Twice." "Both are buried now." He nodded slowly. "They called me rotten for being a widow twice," she said, her voice quiet. "Said no man should trust me." He looked at her for a long moment. "So am I," she turned. "What?" "I lost my wife to fever in Kansas 4 years ago, then married again. She died birthing our child. He did not make it either." The words sat heavy between them. "I am sorry," she said. So am I, he said softly. They sat there, two people with too much loss between them, and something shifted, not like a storm or a fire, more like a gate creaking open. The next morning, Silas insisted on helping. He limped around the yard, splitting wood one-handed. Caleb watched him with wide eyes. I want to learn that, he said. Silas crouched beside him. Then come on. I will teach you how not to lose a finger. By the fifth day, Silas was eating at the table with them. Clara braided his horse's mane. Caleb followed him everywhere. That night, Willa stood at the stove, watching the fire. You are good with them, she said. I like them, he said simply. They are good kids. She turned to face him. And you, are you staying? He met her eyes. You want me to? She did not answer, but she did not look away. He stepped closer. Willa. Her name on his tongue felt like something solid, something real. I have not kissed a man in 2 years, she said. He touched her jaw gently. Then let me remind you how. When his lips touched hers, it was not rushed or hungry, it was careful, steady. Like a man who had lost too much and now knew how to hold something right, she kissed him back. And somewhere deep inside, the part of her that had gone quiet after Jed was buried stirred again. Not with guilt, not with fear, but with hope. She pulled back just enough to look at him. You are not afraid of a woman who has buried 2 husbands? Silas smiled, eyes still on hers. No, ma'am, I am just grateful you are not done loving yet. And for the first time in years, Willa Barnes let herself believe that maybe she was not. The first frost rode in quiet, laying silver across the cornstalks and the fence rails. Willa woke before the sun, as always, and lit the stove with stiff fingers. The cabin creaked with the cold, its timbers restless under the weight of winter's first whisper. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved carefully, not wanting to wake the children or the man still sleeping in the lean-to beside the barn. Silas had chosen it himself, insisting it'd be wrong to sleep under her roof any longer than healing required. He'd taken tools out there, patched a hole in the roof, braced the door frame. She hadn't asked him to. He just did it, like the work comforted him. She carried a pail of warm biscuits wrapped in cloth and a tin of blackberry preserves from last summer's picking. He wasn't expecting breakfast. She knew that, but neither was she offering it just for thanks. When she stepped into the lean-to, Silas was sitting on the overturned crate he used as a bench, sharpening the blade of her drawknife. His coat hung from a nail, his sleeves rolled, and steam rose from the coffee he'd boiled over the brazier. I brought something, she said, setting the food down on the crate beside him. He set the drawknife aside and looked up at her, catching her gaze with a quiet steadiness. Appreciate it? Willa sat across from him on the edge of an old feed barrel. She watched him carefully unwrap the biscuits, the way his fingers moved, slow and certain. She'd seen too many men rush through things, like hunger was a thing to punish. Silas treated it like it deserved patience. That mare of yours has a limp, he said after a few bites. Right hind, she's favoring it down in the pastern. I know, thought it might ease up, but it's hung on. I could pack her hoof with pine tar and wrap it, might help, Willa nodded. I'd be grateful. They ate in silence, the kind that asked nothing. Then, when the biscuits were nearly gone, Willa said, Clara's been drawing pictures of you. She thinks you're some kind of storybook knight. Silas chuckled low in his chest. I'm the far side of noble, I reckon. Been in more fights than prayers. She's 6. She sees what she wants. And you, he asked, his voice quieter now. I see a man who doesn't run from children or work. That's worth more than stories. He looked down at the last biscuit in his hand, then broke it in 2 and held one half out to her. She took it. I never stayed anywhere after Kansas, he said. Didn't figure it was worth the trying, she chewed slowly. Why now? He didn't answer right away. The wind pushed at the boards behind them, and a crow called out from the cottonwoods. Because I don't feel like a ghost here, he said at last. And because you don't treat me like I'm something broken. Willa folded her hands around the tin cup. You're not. He looked at her then, something bare and honest in his eyes. Neither are you. They sat a while longer, watching the first light stretch over the fields. When she rose to go, he stood too, and she saw the stiffness in his side still lingered. Don't overdo it, she said. That wound's healing, but slow. I'll mind it. Back at the cabin, Caleb was trying to fit into Jed's old boots again, the ones too big last winter. They still don't fit, Willa said gently. He sighed and pulled them off. I just wanted to wear 'em when I go help Mr. Silas. She knelt down. We'll make you your own soon enough. Do you think he'll stay? He asked, his voice small. I think he might, she said. If we give him reason to. Later that day, Silas hitched the wagon and took Caleb with him to cut firewood near the ridge. Willa and Clara stayed behind, working through the root cellar to tally what would last the winter and what wouldn't. The girl talked as she worked about birds, about books, about how she wanted to learn to shoot like her brother. After the sun dipped, the wagon returned, full of split logs and laughter. Caleb's cheeks were red with cold, his hands blistered but proud. Did good today, Silas said, climbing down. He's got grit. Willa helped unload the last of the wood, brushing sawdust from her apron as she watched him stack the pieces neatly against the cabin wall. The rhythm of him quiet, capable, steady settled something deep in her. That night, after the children were asleep, Willa stepped out to the lean-to again. She didn't knock. Silas was sitting in the same place, sanding the haft of an axe. He looked up, and his face changed in a way that made her breath catch. She crossed the space between them and took the sandpaper from his hands. You don't have to sleep out here anymore, she said. He stood slowly, like he didn't want to startle the moment. You sure? I wouldn't have come if I wasn't. His hand rose, brushing a curl back from her cheek. Then I'll stay. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. The scent of pine and smoke clung to him, and beneath that, something warm and worn and safe. I never thought I'd want this again, she whispered. Me neither, he said, but they did. And that night, with the frost thickening on the windows and the fire low in the hearth, two people who'd been called cursed, broken, and too much to carry, found the beginning of a life neither had dared to hope for. A week into November, the first real snow came. Not a dusting, but a full drape of white that hushed the land and made the fields vanish under a clean, cold weight. Willa watched it from the porch, a mug of chicory in her hands. The children were inside, sorting through the last of the dried apples, and Silas was mending harness leather by the fire pit, steam curling from the wet hide. She stepped down the 3 porch steps and crossed to him. That's from the team harness, isn't it? He nodded without looking up. Had a weak stitch at the buckle, would have snapped if we hitched him to the plow come spring. You see everything, she said. I just look close, he replied, threading the awl through the thick strap. Learned young that if you ignore the little things, the big ones'll bite you fast. She crouched beside him, her knees stiff from the cold. Where'd you learn leather work? My uncle had a harness shop outside Salina, took me in after my ma passed. I hated the shop at first, smelled like tallow and dust, but the work kept my hands steady. After the war, it was the only thing that still made sense. Willa watched his fingers move sure, unhurried, exact. You never said you were in the war. I was 17 when I signed up. Rode with the cavalry through Tennessee, lost most of my company outside Franklin. He paused, jaw tight, the awl slipping through leather slower now. When it ended, I didn't go home, too much gone there. She didn't press. The past had a way of clinging, and she knew better than most that not everything could be spoken clean. I'm sorry, she said, after a long moment. He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. You say that like it's yours to carry too. It's not. But I know the weight. He set the strap aside and stood, brushing snow from his trousers. Let's go in. You'll freeze your knees off trying to match me in silence. Inside, the cabin was thick with the scent of rendered lard and drying herbs. Clara had hung a row of bright red apples on string above the hearth, and Caleb was rolling a ball of twine between his palms like it might become something more if he wished hard enough. Silas stooped beside him. You've got a steady grip. You ever try tying snares? Caleb looked up, curious. No, sir. I'll show you a few knots after supper. Might be rabbits needing thinning before winter deepens. Willa stirred the pot on the stove. We've got traps behind the barn, some are rusted. Could use your eye. Silas nodded, then picked up some kindling and began laying a fresh fire. The way he moved inside the home had shifted. He no longer paused before touching things, no longer asked if he ought to help. He simply did. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Willa pulled a wool shawl over her shoulders and stepped out back. The stars were sharp above the fields, and the wind had settled into a hush, the kind that only came after snowfall. Silas joined her, his hands bare, his breath catching in the air between them. "Clara asked if I was your husband now," he said, his voice low. Willa looked up at him, the moonlight catching the shape of his jaw. "What did you tell her?" "That I wasn't." Yet, she felt her heart beat once hard. She didn't seem surprised, just asked if she'd still get to keep her own room. Willa laughed softly, the sound small in the stillness. "She's practical. She gets that from you." They stood there for a while, the cold air between them not quite enough to keep them apart. When she finally turned, he reached for her hand and held it with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "You ever think about marrying again?" he asked. "I used to think I'd buried that part of myself," she said. "But lately, I think about what it would be like to build something that doesn't end in loss." He brushed his thumb across her knuckles. "I'm not promising a life without sorrow. But I'd carry it with you if you'd let me." "I'm not afraid of sorrow anymore," she said. "Only of wasting what's still left to give." Silas leaned in then, and she didn't pull away. His kiss was warmer than the fire inside, slow and certain. She stepped into him, into the warmth of his coat, into the steadiness of his arms. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'd marry you tomorrow if you asked." Willa smiled, eyes still closed. "Then ask me." "I will, in the morning," he said quietly. "With the sun up and the children awake. I want them to hear it too." She nodded, her lips brushing his cheek. "Then I'll say yes in the morning." They stood there a little longer, wrapped in the hush of snow and sky and the promise of something lasting. The morning came quiet and pale, the snow outside settled deep enough that the fence posts wore white caps. Willa rose before the children and washed at the basin, the water biting cold. She braided her hair slow, fingers sure, and pinned it back without fuss. The kettle hissed from the stove, and the cabin warmed inch by inch. Silas had already brought in wood. She knew by the neat stack by the stove and the faint print of boots melting on the porch. She opened the door and saw him in the corral, brushing down the gelding with slow sweeps, his breath clouding in the air. He looked up when she stepped out, and she nodded once, not needing to say more. Inside, Clara sat at the table in her nightdress, watching the kettle steam. "Is Mr. Silas still fixing things?" she asked. "No," Willa said. "Not this morning." "What's he doing then?" "He's just being part of the day." Clara seemed to accept that, and Willa set about frying the last of the salt pork while Caleb stirred cornmeal for mush. They worked in a quiet rhythm, the kind that comes not from silence, but from knowing one another well enough not to fill it. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, Silas had come in and washed up, his face ruddy from the cold. He took his place at the table without ceremony, but his eyes met Willa's, and she felt something shift in her chest, warm and steady. After breakfast, she sent Clara and Caleb to gather dry kindling from the shed, giving them space to chatter and kick at the snow. When the door closed behind them, Silas stood and crossed the room, hat in hand. "I've never asked a thing of you, Willa," he said, voice low. "Not before I earned my keep, but I'd ask this now." She met his gaze. "Go on." "I'd marry you today, not for shelter, not for the children, for you. Because you're the only person I've met who makes me want to stay long enough to build something worth keeping." Willa let the words settle. Then she reached for the drawer beneath the cabinet and pulled out the little tin box with Jed's mother's brooch inside. She opened it and took out the plain gold band tucked beneath the lining. "I kept it," she said. "Not out of grief, just never knew what to do with it." Silas looked at the ring, then at her. "I don't want it to be his," she said. "I want it to be yours if you'll take it that way." "I will." She slid it into his palm. His fingers closed around it like he'd been waiting longer than just these past weeks. They didn't hold a church ceremony. The preacher was 30 miles south and snowed in besides. But Silas shaved, and Willa wore her mother's shawl, the one with the faded sage embroidery. Caleb ran a brush through his hair without being asked, and Clara tied a ribbon around her braid. They stood in the parlor, the stove ticking, the windows fogged with breath and heat. Willa took Silas's hands and he took hers, and the children stood between them, solemn and wide-eyed. "I've got no parchment," Silas said, voice steady, "but I've got my word. I'll work this land beside you, raise these two like they're mine from the start, and keep you with care and truth for all my years." Willa's voice was quiet but sure. "I'll share what I've built with you, and I'll build more beside you. You've known sorrow, and so have I. But we're not living there anymore." They kissed, plain and true, with the warmth of the stove and the children watching like sentinels. That night, Silas moved his things into the cabin. Not just his coat and boots, but his tools, the braided leather cord he used to tie bundles, the small carving knife he kept wrapped in cloth. He took the cot from the lean-to and helped Caleb drag it to the loft so the boy could have his own bed at last. When the children were asleep, Willa and Silas sat by the fire with a pot of chicory between them. She leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped an arm around her without asking. "Do you miss Kansas?" she asked. "I miss the dog I had there," he said. "But not the place. You ever think what your life might have been if things had gone another way?" "Sometimes, but not tonight." She rested her cheek against him, eyes on the slow flicker of flame. "Good, I don't want to wonder anymore. I just want to go on from here." They sat like that until the coals dimmed low, and when they rose and walked back toward the sleeping room, Willa didn't feel like a widow anymore. She felt like a wife. And more than that, she felt whole. By late December, the wind had changed. It no longer howled against the eaves like a warning, but moved low through the cottonwoods, soundless and slow. The snow had packed itself tight into the folds of the land, and the sky stayed low and pale as though the sun had grown shy. Willa stood in the barn, brushing down the gelding with a firm hand. She'd taken to the morning tasks herself while Silas worked on the chicken coop behind the shed. The birds had started roosting in the rafters since the old door had warped, and they'd lost 2 hens to a fox last week. He hadn't said much, just taken a saw and some scrap pine and set to fixing it. She liked that about him, the way he answered problems with motion, not noise. Clara and Caleb were in the loft, stringing dried orange peel and cinnamon bark for the shelf garland. Willa had watched them earlier, the way Clara's small fingers moved fast, her tongue tucked at the corner of her mouth in quiet concentration, while Caleb measured each loop with a carpenter's eye. They'd come to Silas with their plans, and he'd listened like it was the most serious thing he'd heard all week. The barn was warm with the breath of the animals and the clean scent of hay. Willa laid a hand on the mare's neck. The limp had eased since Silas packed the hoof, and now the animal stood easy, her eyes half-lidded in comfort. Behind her, the door creaked open. "She's coming along fine," Silas said, stepping inside with a small bundle in his arms. Willa turned, brushing straw from her sleeve. "That for her?" "No, you." He held out a wrapped parcel. "Found something at the trading post last week, but you were busy with the preserves and I didn't want to interrupt." She took the bundle, peeling back the paper to find a pair of wool-lined gloves, soft and dark with neat, tight stitching. She turned them over, fingers brushing the seams. "You didn't have to," she said, "I know. But your hands have been chapped since the frost set in, and I figured you'd never buy something for yourself if the children needed boots first." She didn't answer right away, just slipped the gloves on, flexing her fingers. They fit close, and she could feel the warmth already gathering inside. "I don't quite know what to say," she said finally. "Then don't," he told her. "Just wear them." She stepped forward and touched his collar, brushing a bit of sawdust from it. "You're good at seeing what's needed," she said. "Only because I've gone too long without it myself," he replied. She leaned in then, kissed his cheek, and let her lips linger there a moment longer than habit could excuse. That night, after supper, they sat at the table with the children, candles lit low in the hearth's warm glow. Caleb pulled out a folded sheet of paper he'd kept tucked behind the storage crate. He laid it flat, smoothing the creases with both palms. "It's a map," he said, "of our place. I drew the barn and the coop and the creek trail and the spot where Clara saw the owl." Willa leaned over his shoulder. The lines were wobbly in places, but the care was clear. He'd marked the fence rows, the well, even the old stump where she had once split kindling before sunrise. Silas crouched beside him. "You got a good eye." "I want to build more," Caleb said. "A smokehouse. And a shed for the tack." Willa glanced at Silas, who gave a small nod. "We'll do it come spring," he said. Clara pointed to a corner of the map. "That's where we should plant the berries, where the sun hits longest." Willa brushed a hand over her daughter's braid. "We'll need to keep the deer out." "I can help with fencing," Silas said. "We'll do it proper." That night, when the children had gone to bed, Willa and Silas sat by the fire with a pot of beans simmering for the next day. She ran her fingers along the edge of his hand, tracing the calluses and the healed scar on his thumb. "You ever think the past would let you have this?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, "but I stopped asking for permission." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I used to wonder if steady days were only for people who didn't lose too much." "They're for people who choose to keep going anyway," he said. She looked up at him. "You've given me more than I knew I still needed." He smiled, soft and certain. "You gave me a place I didn't know I belonged to." He rose then, took her hand and led her to the bedroom where the lantern burned low and the quilt lay fresh from the line, still faintly scented with lavender. He undressed with quiet care, each movement unhurried, and she followed, her eyes never leaving his. They lay down together not out of want, but out of trust, the kind born of long days and quiet work and shared glances that spoke more than words ever could. He touched her like someone who understood the weight of absence, and she welcomed him like someone who had finally found solid ground after years of drifting. In the morning, they rose before the sun. He saddled the gelding while she packed a basket with boiled eggs and bread. They rode out to the ridge where the fields opened wide, white with snow and quiet as breath. He stopped the horse and helped her down, and they stood there, the sky just beginning to warm at the edges. "This land doesn't know our past," he said. "Only what we do with it now." She turned to him, eyes clear. "Then let's build something that lasts." And they did. They built the smokehouse in early spring, with Caleb hammering nails and Clara painting the door with leftover blue from the chicken coop. They planted berries along the ridge and strung wire to keep the deer out. They harvested in summer, canned in fall, and sang quiet songs by the fire when winter came again. The old griefs never vanished, but they stopped echoing. Willa no longer woke reaching for an absence. Silas no longer watched the door like someone might leave. The past was not erased, but it was outgrown. And when the children grew strong and sure, and the fence posts stood straight and the roof never leaked, Willa and Silas often sat on that porch in the quiet dusk and held hands like they had something worth keeping. Because they did. Because they had each other. And it was enough.